Right, everybody, welcome. I can't believe episode number 20. This is ridiculous that this is our 20th episode, and we started this in March. Tonight, we have a special guest, Jake Hukee with Starward. We're going to be talking about that in a few minutes. Before we do so, a few housekeeping items. This is our first interview where samples have been provided to us by the actual distributor to a wide audience. Now, if you did not get any samples, I have to tell you why. Because we only had a limited number. We had 25 samples that we could give out. And Eric is actually keeping track of how many people show up to these things and how frequently they show up. So we decided to do it based on who's been here and how many times. And those are the people who got the samples. And so just remember, you are being watched because that's how Big Brother works. Eric knows. Jake, you and I live in the same neighborhood. We're about 3/4 of a mile away from each other right now. Welcome. And I'm going to ask you the first question, which is important since most of us here do have the samples. In what order are we going to be going through these things? If you could repeat that for me, please.
Yeah, not a problem. First of all, Gil, thanks for having me once again. It's a pleasure judging a whiskey competition with you a few months back, couple of months back now. It's great to be here. I'm so glad that people actually got the samples and are tuning in because you never know sometimes. Free whiskey, might as well take that and run. But with that, we will be tasting Twofold first, then followed by Nova, Solera, and then we'll cap things off with a little treat from Benny's Barrel Select that we just launched about 3 weeks ago.
Okay, so I'm going to repeat that for everybody. We're starting with Twofold, then Nova, then Solera, then the Benny's Cask. Now, for those of you who haven't done this stuff virtually before, I strongly recommend that you drink out of glasses, that you pour into glasses. We have some significant pours here from Jake, and if you drink out of the bottle, then, do you want to use it again later, share it with other people? You're better off pouring it into a glass, and that way you can also add some water to it if you would like. So Jake, let's do this first. Tell us, what is the Twofold?
Yeah, absolutely. So Twofold is our double grain whiskey from Starward that we kind of started making essentially for the American market. Our founder, Dave Vitale, big fan of single malts, even more what he calls himself a frustrated home brewer is kind of how he got into the whole spirits world. But Twofold was his love for single malt and then high wheated bourbons, obviously, that we have here in America. And what he thought was, why don't we use the two most reputable grains in Australia and more specifically in the state of Victoria, which we are located in Port Melbourne. So right there, basically a mile south of Melbourne is where a distillery, downtown Melbourne is where a distillery is located. So we started using these two grains. It is a marriage of malted barley and wheat being the predominant grain, about 60% wheat, 40% malted barley. And both of those grains are distilled separately and then barrel aged separately inside of red wine casks that we gather from all across vineyards in the southern coast of Australia and a little bit of the west coast of Australia too. The kind of unique thing that we do with all of our whiskeys at Starward is that we completely mature our whiskeys inside of red wine casks that are all local vineyards to us in the country of Australia. We wanted to really bring that whole Australian experience into the bottle. Terroir is one word to describe it, but it's more just a representation of what Australia can be inside of a whiskey bottle. So we started making this wheat after making single malt whiskey for almost 8 to 9 years at our distillery. And it was a really great execution of what American markets like, but also kind of what's going on across the world where bourbons are becoming such a popular product, specifically with wheat. And we wanted to make it with the two grains most available to us. So we started to make this about 4 years ago. Both the whiskeys are aged for about 3 years inside of a variety of Shiraz, Pinot, and Cab casks. And then after about a 3 to 4 year maturation, they're married together and vatted together for about 5 days before bottling.
And every year's version of this, is it designed to be approximately the same every year, or does it depend on what comes out of the stills?
So we're trying to create consistency with everything we produce, this being one of the products too. It's now a mainstay of ours that we launched, and using a variety cast actually lends us to be creating more of a consistency of flavors inside of our whiskeys from year to year. we're continuously making this whiskey repeatedly. This and Nova are our two main products, along with Solera being the third one, as our three core products that we have here in the United States, and then also what we take worldwide and more focused just in Australia too. From that standpoint, we do other single loft projects or once a year releases, but these three that we're going to be trying here tonight are our mainstay and our core products. So we actually use a wheat facility that creates wheated products just up the street from our distillery. We use their still, which is a column still, where the barley is traditionally used on our double pot still distillate techniques that we have all set up to us. So the wheat, it's not necessarily sourced. We actually go to this plant and make it with them. So it's always specifically designed to.
So you're involved in the process. You're making sure you're involved in the process.
And we just renovated our distillery, so we will be eventually making everything, all the wheat at our facility. But we have about a 40,000 gallon just silos essentially for barley, where we do all the barley distillation at our in-house.
Nice. One point of direction I want to give to everybody here. This could turn into a free-for-all if I ask everybody for their opinions on the whiskeys now, so we're not going to do that. But what I would like is that when we do get to the Q&A, it'd be really good if people can just briefly say which one was their favorite and why, what they like, and we'll hear more about what people think about the whiskeys at that point. By the way, I love the sweetness of this. I love the sweetness, and there's some fruitiness. Also, it's a little bit dry, maybe from the dryness might be from one of the wines, but it's delicious, and I'm enjoying it very much. Am I correct that you started your whiskey career with our local distillery here, Koval? Is that right?
Yeah, it was my first full-time job at a distillery back in 2014, 2015. I really can't remember. Was in the beer world a little bit, but
so how did that, like, what were you doing with Koval?
Yeah, I started off as part-time, just doing tastings and such. I was in a little bit of a corporate kind of event planning world before this, and doing beer on the side when it came to designing labels and doing some graphic design work and photography for some small breweries, and then also writing for a website and taking photos for goodbeerhunting.com, and basically just doing it as a hobby on the side. As I visited all these places across the country for work, I would just go to the breweries there and hang out. But with Koval, it was like, I just want to get into whiskey. It's a passion of mine. It's a love of mine. And I took the first job they had available, which was a part-time tasting job, and did that for about 2 months. And they had a full-time position opened up. And our vice president made it a joke that my title was Jake of all trades. Didn't really necessarily have.
Oh, that hurts. That's painful.
Yeah, it was a little bit of everything. I've been infatuated with distilling since I was a kid. My grandpa worked for Jim Beam.
Nice.
Yeah, he was there in the late 80s through about 2004, 2005, the same year that Booker passed away. He was the same year he retired. And he saw the whole development of craft whiskey, a small batch whiskey being developed at Beam through Booker's lens. And it really caught my attention. I heard these stories, my grandpa tell me about these characters that he worked with. And, as a kid, you didn't know who they were. Even as a 20-year-old kid, I didn't know who they were. But when I started doing my research and whiskey became more a part of my life, craft spirits became part of my life, not just whiskey, but also beer. You started putting the pieces together, and you realize, like, these characters are like Booker and Baker and Fred, and like now all these
and all of a sudden you know who he's talking about.
Right. It's like, so that's who's the mistress pulled a gun on that guy in his bed on Christmas Eve, those kind of stories.
It's funny. We actually a few months ago, about a month and a half ago, we interviewed Paul Scott. Paul from he's part of the company that imports Armoric from France. And he started telling us some stories, and all of a sudden, we could sort of tell that there was some family thing going on here. Turns out that his family is the Scott's Selection Scott.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, that was a big oh wow. And he was telling us some of the bottles that they have and some of the stories of people. So they're definitely, it's nice when people have a pedigree. Before I ask you the next question, we're going to be moving on now to the Nova. Can you tell us about the Nova and what it is that we are about to be drinking?
Yeah, Nova is truly our flagship whiskey. It's something that we pride ourselves on bringing a single malt from Australia to the rest of the world. That's just for sure statement right there. We created this whiskey from day one. It was all about making single malt whiskey. Nova, meaning new, was about how can we bring Australia in a bottle to the rest of the world? So barley is the most spreadable grain. It's drank a lot in Australia, obviously, because like you said, the pedigree from where most Australians do come from, originate from with their heritage. It's a lot of relates back to single malt. In Dave Vitale, our founder, he started off making single malt whiskey, but his whole unique, I guess, pattern or what unique insight to the whiskey world that he brought was using these Shiraz casks, these Pinot casks, these cab casks from local wineries that nobody was really doing full maturations inside of, and the casks themselves were really used for anything other than barrel aging wine, and then being pretty much just sold off to like gardeners or people who wanted to use them as little like plant boxes and things like that. So he took a chance and started using these casks. In all of these casks that Nova are in, it's mostly Shiraz. There's about 25 barrels in a batch of our whiskey, our single malt whiskey, and probably going to be about 13 to 15 of them be a Shiraz cast and a little Pinot, little cab spread throughout there. And we do a little pot still distillation to honor the traditions of the past, but we do new things about like using these Shiraz casks, making our new make essentially as if we were making a saison. Dave is a brewer at heart. All of our distilling team are brewers as well, who've worked in craft breweries across Victoria, the state of Victoria, and they wanted to kind of honor those traditions that they had developed and what they like about it, where all of our people who do basically our wood policy and our barrel aging policy are all winemakers. And the combination of brewery people and a little bit of winery people mixed into a distillery creates a really delicious single malt whiskey that we thought truly represents Australia.
And what's the mash bill in this?
100% malted barley.
And so this is all local barley to the Melbourne area?
Yeah, all of our farmers are within a day's drive, we say, to our distillery. We, in all honesty, too, to be frank, we are at the behest now of what we can get from farmers with the fires that happened earlier this year. Then, along with COVID, it's still close. It's still within still the same state, but at the same time, we have to know like we also have to be realistic to the fact that we can't necessarily get everything we want and when we want it.
Right. I got to tell you, this is. First of all, the legs on the whiskeys are amazing. I love, when I tilt it and I see the legs coming down here. That must be, it really. There's good texture to these. But this reminds me of a good Speyside. A nice, sherry aged Speyside. It's really, it's got it. It's good stuff. And by the way, when we go through, like later when you look at the recording, Eric, can you answer a question for me? Are the comments part of the recording?
They're not, but I can post them to the Facebook group afterwards.
I think that, if you can, because several people I noticed, I don't pay much attention to the chat while I'm writing the interview because, I've got other things on my mind. But I have noticed that people have been writing comments about the whiskey in the chat. And I think that would be great for Jake, just to see. So any comments that any of you guys have about these whiskeys, please put them in there. Okay, it'd be great. Yeah, Jake, I'm enjoying this.
Todd right now, he's right on the nose with it all. The black pepper, it's definitely there. The Shiraz influence too. And then once it opens up, there's these like mango and tropical fruit notes that really come from the new make that we produce it at and carry out those flavors inside of the whiskey. And if you let it sit, it's almost like a candy strawberry effect to it. Like if you had like a fruit roll up or something like that and let it sit on your tongue and kind of develop and let those flavors just develop inside of your mouth. It's these really great strawberry essences to it too, but the pepperiness, it carries through entirely, where after the glass has been open and settles, I get a lot of nice clove flavor to it at the end of the day. But it's one of those whiskeys I don't say it because I know it sounds biased, but it's one of those whiskeys when I drink it every single time, I find something different about it.
Right. Look, I got to tell you something. There's nothing wrong with that. I mean, let's face it. You do work for the company. I mean, when I back to Paul Scott, when I asked Paul, what's your favorite go-to whiskey right now, and his favorite was the Armoric and the Pinot de Charon cast. He just loves that stuff, And when Steph Ridgway was doing Old Pulteney, she just loved the Huddart. It's like there's nothing wrong with that. It's good. It's good stuff. Can you tell me a little bit about where exactly is this grain coming from? Okay, so are these farmers that you're working with? How does that work with respect to your grains? Or,
Yeah.
or do you own these farms, or are these just people you're contracting with?
Totally contracting all the farmers. Most of it is pretty close. I would say for us, it'd be like a drive from here to Southern Illinois, kind of like that, put it in distance and perspective. But
Mhm.
the infrastructure of roads isn't always as easy as it is here in America as it is in Australia. So a days drive away might be a little bit longer than we would anticipate from driving. But yeah, it's all contracted. We don't own any of our farms. It's just farmers that we work with. But it's kind of interesting. There's farmers that are making more barley because distilling's becoming a boom like it is here in America, where farmers are now growing more corn and growing more rye here in the Midwest to cater to the distilleries that are now popping up. So it has that impact on it where distilling essentially wasn't really around 20 to 25 years ago in Australia, even though it has a long tradition of single malt distillations. There's a company called Federal Distilling that was around in the late 1800s, early 1900s. That was one of the largest producers of single malt across the entire world. But
Really?
due to the effects of World War One and Prohibition, and then pretty much after World War II, the distillation industry was pretty much gone. And it wasn't until Bill Lark of Lark Distilling, where actually David, our owner, learned at and apprenticed at. He started his distillery around 20 years ago, and it's a very well-known distillery, I think, in the whiskey world. And he brought back craft distilling essentially. And Dave, who's one of the pioneers, our owner, carried on that tradition by doing new styles of not new styles of whiskey, but bringing new innovations to distillation in Australia.
So before I ask you the next question, please tell us about the Solera, the next one
Yeah.
that's on our list here.
So even though that Nova is our flagship and it's the most produced, Solera is where the company actually started. Dave, when I was talking about earlier about getting those wine casks, the very first wine casks he ever got were a para cask, which is Australian sherry. Just don't tell a Spaniard that. But yeah, might be offended. You never know. But he got these casks from a local winery called Yalumba that he got a connection with, and they had these really great 30-gallon casks that some of these barrels were 30 years old, and they were maturing whiskey, maturing wine inside of there for ages. Just a generation, almost generation. And it's a family-owned operation, and they have their own cooperage. And they're like, "Hey, would you want these wine barrels?" And he thought, "Yeah, this is where I want to start. I want to use something that's super hyper local to my whiskey and bring that effect to our product." And so he didn't really have any money to buy them, and they kind of just gave it on credit of him being a nice guy and trusting he would pay him back in the future. And rightfully he did, after he took these barrels and got them charred to where he wanted them, to the point where we thought it would be appropriate to have the char level to this whiskey, and started barrel aging his single malts inside of these Apera wine casks. They're about 30-gallon casks, and some of the staves are almost 60 years old that he'd rebuild these casks with in the future.
These are smaller. So the Solera is aged in smaller casks.
Yeah,
many of which are older casks. Okay.
Older casks, and they're always charred. Where Nova and Twofold, the casks are only about 25% of the casks are going to be charred. We do steam those, wet them a little bit, get them hydrated to bring them a little bit back to life. But we really love our wine barrels to have a freshness to them, to be wet, have a little wine inside of there as well, and then put our whiskey inside of them. But with Solera, it's always a para cask, Australian sherry, charred, and 30 gallons typically. And we put our single malt in there. We let it age for around 3 years. And then we have a Solera vat where we have the very first products Dave ever produced 13 years ago, now mingling with our newest batches of whiskey. So technically there is a little bit, and theoretically there's a little bit of the very first batches of whiskey, single malt whiskey that Dave ever produced at Starward, along with our latest batches. Yeah. So
is this going to have to be though, like a limited edition though? Because from the way you're describing those casks,
yeah,
those aren't readily available.
No, and there's a reason why I only gave you a half sample.
I noticed.
We noticed.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm so sorry. Someone's like, "What the hell is this guy?" Like, he just told me.
Yeah, who is this guy? What the hell is he giving us?
You can't measure out correctly.
That's right.
So yeah, with that, the casks are very now wanted and sought after. Where Dave paid $80 these casks individually 12 years ago or so. Now I was talking to a distiller over in Australia last spring when I was there, or 2 springs ago, whatever the calendar says, and they paid $900 per pair of casks, and they bought 4 of them. The breweries want them, the gin distilleries want them, the whiskey distilleries obviously want them too. So they aren't readily available, and we're only releasing about 10 to 15% of that 5,000 liter vat at a time, or 3,000 liter vat at a time. So we're not letting a lot go because we want to really age our whiskey between 3 to 4 years inside. Before
I'm going to stop you because I'm going to ask you for a favor.
Yeah.
The next time they're released, let us know. Okay.
So,
because otherwise these things sell out rather quickly, and a little bit of advance warning would be nice.
For sure. We do have some available. We released it in the United States last year in the fall. We only got about 98 cases of it in 35 or so in Chicagoland area. And we've only released 17 cases of it in 2020. Still available at Binny's, Gold Eagle.
And when's the next batch of it going to be coming out? Like the next oldest one?
Probably, I would say probably set around Father's Day.
Okay. So one thing I noticed is that none of these have age statements on them.
No. So we call it elementally matured, just because the effects of the 4 seasons in a day, what we call it with Australia, is a really diverse climate to age whiskey inside of. It has fluctuations in temperatures between 35 to 40 degrees Fahrenheit in a single day. And I definitely experienced that while I was over there during their fall, when it'd be 70 degrees in the day, gets dark, 50 degrees, and all of a sudden it's 35 degrees when you wake up in the morning around 6:30. And we love to play around with that, but we also have this heavy wine influence from the barrels we're playing with. We have a fluctuation in temperature. We don't think we have to age for 6 years because we don't want to get that oak overflow into our whiskey.
Especially with the smaller casks too. You have to be
that's only for Solera. We are using 53-gallon casks for everything else right now, and we do have some hogsheads casks for special projects too.
Big ones,
Yeah, so we do play around. So predominantly, we're doing standard size casks for everything. We aren't trying to shock the whiskey into aging or anything like that. It's just that we don't want to get too much effect of the barrel because we're usually losing around 6% of volume a year from the barrel aging, as even as high as 8 to 10% sometimes. Right. And we enter at barrel proof around 110, and we usually go up. We usually pull out between 116 to 118, and then bring it down to around 80 proof for most of our whiskeys too.
Right. We were speaking a few weeks ago. We spoke with Sam Filmus from Impacts. We were talking about the same thing with respect to aging in a hot climate like Israel. Okay, with milk and honey, with M&H. And in
M&H.
A few weeks, right, M&H, and then in a little while we're going to be talking. Right, not milk and honey anymore. Now it's M&H. And we're going to be talking to Raj Sabararhal. I can't. About Amrut. And the whole concept of aging in areas that are not Scotland, or not Tennessee and Kentucky or Indiana, it's very different. So many of us on this call are very familiar with and good friends with Brett Pantani from Binny's. Okay, we've actually we've been holding a private tasting with Brett for I believe 18 years, once a year. Wow. I've known Brett for about 25 years now. And
you know him better than I do.
I don't want to think about where you were 25 years ago. That's a different issue. So I see here that we have a Binny's single cask.
Right.
Okay. So tell us about the process of getting a Binny's single cask when you're all the way in Australia, and what exactly is this and what's special about it?
100%. Yeah. So obviously when you open up in the US, you want to be in your major markets, and Chicago being one of the great drinking cities across the world, you have to be in Binny's. And that's one of our first approaches. We're in pretty much all the stores when it comes to the 44 Binny's they have now. I've lost count after 41, but we made it.
Damn, that's good.
Yeah.
That's
so
good.
Made it very much a point of interest for us to get in there and make good relationships with them. And we were fortunate enough to bring in about 17 to 18 barrel picks to the U.S. last year, and have people start tasting them out, and then into this year as well. And Binny's was one of our first stops. We brought them 4 picks. I tried about 7 to 8 of the samples we had across the United States. In my mind, there was 3 A+. This is one of them, and the other 2 just happened to be in Chicagoland as well. So I'm really
that's a crying shame. That is a shame that happened.
Just so sorry that happened that way. But so what we want to do with our our barrel picks is really highlight Nova and what it can be at a higher proof when we basically are bottling at 110 proof, about 54.6 or 100, 54.3 ABV on that one. And it's a lower barrel proof for us. Like I said, we're usually around that 116 mark, 118 mark, but it was in a cooler part of the distillery. It's 100% barrel aged inside of a single, probably Shiraz cask. I technically can't say what it really was, but it was probably a Shiraz cask for 3 years, and that's it. And then we finished this one. I believe we finished this one in a French oak barrel.
How much did that bottle run for? I know that Eric Leader just bought a bottle.
Yeah, I got one right here.
$64.99.
That's all?
Yeah, $64.99
Are there any left
for this guy.
Any left in the stores?
There's a few left. I know the Lincoln Park and Lakeview. Lincoln Park has the most. Lakeview went through like 8 out of 12 bottles in about 2 weeks. That was pretty cool. There's still a couple there. As I live right across the street from me.
Yeah, I know you live right across. Yeah, I got to tell you, Ross. The manager of that store. I love that guy.
He's a drinking buddy at Fountainhead of mine. So
Ross is a great guy.
So we really wanted to highlight what we thought Nova can be on an elevated level from itself, as our flagship product. And this one's like a Pinot bomb for me. I opened it up and I just had Pinot and dark chocolate notes to it. Something that's super delicious.
I'm going to interrupt you for a second. We have two people on here who live in Boston. Do any of the Boston outlets have your single cask barrels available?
No single cask in Boston. We are distributed though in Boston. So Twofold, Nova, and Solera are available up in Massachusetts.
Okay, so the first three are available in Massachusetts. Okay, but the single cask is not. Okay, interesting.
If you really want a single cask, just message me and we'll see what we can do.
Y'all hear that? Okay.
Yeah.
Yes.
It does say you recorded.
Right. Hey, you know what? There's no laws anymore with alcohol. We're just in the wild, wild west, the COVID world. So, we'll see what happens.
It's funny that you mentioned that because a few people who got these samples from us, it's funny, like Arthur Elstein is on here right now, and Becca and a few other people. They asked me if they were allowed to taste before tonight. And I said, there are no rules. There are no rules. You do whatever you want. It's totally fine with us. No, it's all good. So I do have just two more questions before I open it up to everybody else. One question is this. So talk about the international markets a little bit. Where does Starward show up in the world? Is the United States your primary market outside of Australia? How does that work?
Yeah, great question. Australia is our home base. It's what we rely on. This is our best year to date actually ever as a company in Australia. So obviously COVID has an impact on that, but it shows you and highlights how they really take responsibility of their own brands too, as we do here in the United States. So it's a really great impact to have there. We opened up in the US about a little over a year and a half ago, in March of 2019. I should know because I was the first employee that was hired in the US. So had a lot of ground to cover a little bit there at the very beginning of us all. And then we also opened up in Europe at the same time. So we now have a heavier distribution in the UK and Germany, France. We've also opened up in some Asian markets too since the beginning of this year. Since beginning of 2020. But yeah, the US is definitely becoming a point of interest, I would say, for our company. It's not even just about sales. It's about social media. It's about marketing. We know if you want to be a true player inside of the whiskey world, with the world whiskey category basically growing and surpassing everybody now when it comes to sales, because you can put in those Asian distilleries, you can put in Australia, you can put in other parts of the world that are now catching up to America, and Scotland and Ireland have been doing it from generation to generation. These other places across the world are showcasing what they can really do by using everything local and creating some really great whiskey and really great spirits along the way. So
it's funny you mentioned about the the category, because I've been going to Binny's for over 25 years, and it's funny how yeah, right, you were old enough then. It's funny how the aisles have changed, and how we had this explosion over the last few years of American whiskeys, just a huge explosion, but then also the whole section of world whiskeys. It's like you have your Japanese, you have your Indian, you obviously have your Australian, you have your French, they're from all over the place now.
Yeah.
And it's growing. And in that section, there's some real quality stuff, but the problem is every once in a while, it's tough to find the section depending the store you're in.
Right. And you just hope you aren't on the bottom of that shelf too.
Right. Well, so is that part of your job too? Is the whole concept of, shelf space and how things are being displayed and stuff like that?
Yeah, it's a part of it. We actually have a sales portfolio manager that we have with our company. So they help out with that a lot too in the merchandising realm. Then I do a lot of things like this and a lot of education. I'm part of our creative marketing team too, because there's such a small force and you have to kind of throw all hands on deck when it comes to making sure this company can survive in the U.S. where we're approaching 3,000 craft distilleries just in the U.S. alone, and then you put in all the influence from across the world. That America has to be one of your main focuses if you really want to be a new world whiskey in a whole world whiskey. The whole encompassing world whiskey of it all, where the whole world basically is making really great products. So yeah, it's definitely about that too, and trying out independent stores as well, where you just really want to go in there and talk to people one-on-one, and you have to build those relationships on a daily basis,
which of course now is much more difficult because we can't do it in person, for obvious reasons. Your job, I mean, we've been talking with people like you obviously for many months now, and it really must be difficult to do the job.
It's just you don't want to bother anybody. You don't want to put anybody in harm's way. And that's my biggest fear every day when I wake up. It's like, okay, I have these, let's say 5, 6, 8 places I want to go to and talk to, but I also don't want to pop in. I don't want to, if we're a smaller independent store, I don't want to be one of the 3 people they're allowed to have in their store at a time, taking up their time. So it's a lot about reaching out and making sure you can have planned appointments versus just dropping in and doing cold calls these days, which cold calling is such a part of your job. But now you just don't want to catch anybody off guard because you don't know how everybody's going to react. And everybody has the right to react differently. They can either be more passive about it if they want to be, or they can be very cautious too.
Right. And again, like with respect to when people are allowed to open up these samples, there are no particular rules. We each are deciding how we want to get it done, but we all are trying to respect everybody's decisions on this stuff. So usually I might go a little bit longer in the interview, but I'm going to stop because of the very simple fact that people have been tasting things, and it'd be nice to hear what they think about what they're tasting. Before we do that, Eric, do you have any particular questions or actually observations about the whiskeys? And before you answer that, I'm just going to say, of these, my favorite without a doubt is that Binny's cask. I think that is rich, that is delicious, it is spicy, it's full-bodied, it's got great legs. Really enjoying it. I mean, that is great stuff. Of the others, I think that the Nova is probably my second one. Okay, I like the Nova a lot. That is, it's really good. And again, you mentioned the spicy, the pepperiness of it that Todd Coe brought up. That was great. But Eric, on to you.
Thanks. Actually, I agree with Gil. The Binny Select is definitely my favorite. I love the Solera. The Solera is just so drinkable. I could just sit back, relax, and just have a glass of that. And I see there's 11 still left at the downtown Binny, so I might have to go downtown. Actually, the one question that I had for you, which we haven't touched on, is what got you, from being in Chicago, what got you into Starward? What did you seek out them? They seek out you? I mean, how did you hook up with an Australian company?
Yeah, definitely. Great question. So I was at Koval for about 4 years, as I talked about, and just like in any time, it was time to move on. I took on a photography kind of ambassador project with a company called Slow and Low, which kind of makes your whole rock and rye type of thing. And I drove their whiskey van around for a few months one summer and across America and took photos and hung out and drank whiskey. It's kind of like the time of my life, in a way.
That sounds awesome.
Yeah.
Actually,
it was
Slow
cool.
Low is great. It tastes exactly, actually, Becca will agree with me. It tastes exactly like Faygo Rock and Rye.
Yeah. Heck
It
yeah.
is weird because I grew up in Detroit, so I always had Faygo Rock and Rye. And the first time I had this, I was like, oh my God, this tastes exactly like Faygo.
Right. Yeah, no, it's fun. It's just like a fun category, and I just wanted something new and something that was a little bit more on the creative side, and a little bit of adventure at the same time. But it was only a contracted job for a few months, and they offered me a job out in California. But my newly fiance at the time, she did not think that was a great idea for me to move to California for a few months, and I think she was right. So I started freelancing. I started just working for some local breweries that I had relationships with. I started writing for places like Whiskey Wash and got back to good beer hunting. But I also started my own whiskey website and my own whiskey podcast because it was something I'm passionate about. I wanted to tell the stories of whiskey and tell people behind the bottle what their story was. And I was out at Benny's at their World of Whiskies in 2019 and that March, and I met one of my old sales rep at Slow and Low, who's now a sales rep for Starward, and she's like, "Hey, try this whiskey. It's amazing. It's new. It's from. I'm not going to tell you where it's from." And she gave me Nova. I thought maybe it was a Irish like sherry cask finish to it. I didn't know. I was confused by it, which I loved about it. And then she introduced me to the owner, Dave Vitale, who had just moved to the United States that week. And we hit it off. And an hour later, he offered me a job. So it wasn't me seeking them out at all. It was me definitely wanted to stay relevant in the whiskey world with the people that I knew and the relationships I had, but a lot of that was through a podcast and through writing and taking photos and visiting places. But once I met Dave, who's just one of the most genuine human beings I've met in my entire life, and then I tasted his products, and he said, "Would you be the first guy to represent my company in America?" I thought that was a heavy responsibility. I had a few other job offers with some bigger distilleries and one giant brewery here to do more creative content creation stuff, but I wanted to tell a story of whiskey, and this is a story I felt like I was compelled to tell, and it was a no-brainer. I was like, yeah, let's do it. And a year and a half since then or so, we've been traveling the United States and talking about Starward and spreading the good word and things like this.
That's cool.
Great. So Eric, why don't you moderate the Q&A and get people involved? But remember, we do want to get people's opinions, so try to be as brief as possible while you're also asking Jake questions at the same time.
Hit me with them all.
All right.
Even if you want to have a twofold question, go in that order, whatever. Yeah, it's like.
Well, first of all, thanks for doing this. It's really nice to have you out here. It's very kind of you to send all these samples out to all of us so we could really experience what you're talking about. It sounds from a climate point of view that the aging is somewhat similar to bourbon in that you have the high temperatures and the fluctuations in temperatures. But is there any thought, I know it's a younger distillery, is there any thought to having, as the distillery matures, to having longer age ranges on your whiskeys? And I think in particular the twofold is great, but I think it might even taste better after more years in the barrel. So I don't know if that's an option for you guys.
Yeah, I mean, it's something that it's considered, but not really fully invested into. It is like Kentucky in the sense that it's like that 4 months out of the year, maybe 5 months out of the year in Kentucky, but that's like that every day in Melbourne. So it kind of creates, not every day, but let's say 9 out of 12 months. And it creates just too much of the barrel flavor. It loses its essence in a way. And we're also losing a lot of whiskey too at the end of the day. So if we did a 10-year-old whiskey, we might come out of it with only, half a cask, if that. It's for us, it's not a price point. I had a 8-year-old Nova when I was over there, and it was one of the only barrels they've let go on, and they just do some bottlings at the distillery. We have a 300-person bar at our distillery, so we do a lot of major events there. It's awesome space. Whenever we can travel again, and you want to go out there and you want to go to Starward, please let me know, and we'll make sure you have a first class experience. But it's great. It's tasty in a way, but I don't think it ever can be consistent too. The temperatures just swing too much. We use all these different barrels as well, but we're using Shiraz, Pinot, and Cab casks, and some other interesting casks too from vineyards that are pretty local to us. But if you want to create and capture what we have in a bottle right now, we don't think we could do that over a 6 to 8 year span. And some of the barrel picks that I presented to buyers that I respect the hell out of, and I just value their opinion more than anybody in this world. I brought them barrel selects that were 3 years, 1 month old, and they're like, "What is this? A 10, 12-year-old whiskey?" The effects of the climate on our whiskey is uncomparable in a way. It's different in all parts of the world. Absolutely, obviously in Taiwan and what's happening in Mexico now too, with certain distilleries and all across the world. It's different in every place, but Australia is truly unique to its own. And for us, we don't really tend to go over that 4 to 5 year maturation. What we could do differently, like you said, with twofold, maybe we'll let the wheat age a little bit longer potentially in the future, where we keep the essentially Nova, which it is, it's a single malt of ours, in that 3 to 4 year range. We could let the wheat possibly go to that 6 to 7 year range, and then do some special releases with that. But at the time being, there's no interest or no, I guess, future of us going over 5 years probably as a distillery for barrel aging. And we're young too. I mean, like it could right. change, but yeah.
That was a great question. Answer. Thank you very much.
Yeah, man. Paul, I know you have a question.
Paul always has two.
At least.
That's why I was going to defer to everyone else for now to give everyone else a chance. But I'll go with one. I'll go with your original instructions about the twofold. So you said that that's actually two separate distillations at both your location on the pot still and a nearby location on a column still. But for the wheated portion on the column still, is it 100% wheat? And if so, how do you get the fermentation? Is it added enzymes, or is there a touch of malted barley that goes into that mash?
It's first of all, it's 100%. Oh, some cool feedback there. It's 100% malted or 100% wheat. Yes, for that. And we do add some enzymes to it, not the malted barley. Malted barley kind of plays a factor into that once it's fatted together. I think it's kind of where it smooths that creaminess and richness to it. In that sense, we do use mostly a brewer's yeast for everything. As I talked about earlier, we're trying to make essentially beer on the front end of it all. We actually dry hop our new make and do some fun things with that. Yeah, I know you like that, Paul. Yeah,
second question there.
I don't know the exact answers to that because I've only tasted it off the still. You've had the new make, right, Paul?
No.
Oh, well, I have a little bit.
No.
I thought you've had it that one night,
no.
But maybe not. Yeah, it's weird. It's something that we get off our fermenters, and then also in our new make at the end of the day to create our white dog. It's this really tropical banana mango fruit flavor. So I think it's prevalent in both Nova and 2-4. A little bit in Solera. It's a bit different with all those casks being combined together from year to year. But I think it's still a little bit prevalent too. I think it's still there in essence. But yeah, it says the wheat stills, or the wheat we produce, 100% wheat, then adding in there a little bit of some enzymes to help it out along the way.
Banana clove sounds like a Hefeweizen wheat yeast.
Ooh, well, now you have a new idea to pitch to Dave Vitale whenever you meet him in person. Whiskey Fest 2021.
Okay, next. Who do we have next?
Todd?
Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead. Thanks.
Hey, Todd.
So first of all, I love all four of these in very different ways. Like the Nova, if you had told me it was like a Glendronach or something like that expression, right, I'd have believed you. And I desperately want a cigar with this Benny's Barrel Select. I'm curious about these cards you supplied with the cocktail recipes. That's an interesting approach from a single malt distillery. I don't know offhand of another single malt distillery that's immediately introducing cocktail ideas for their juice. I think it's a neat idea. I'm wondering about the genesis of that thought process.
Yeah. It's a great question, and something I should do better as a brand ambassador to actually tell you, because it's all a part of our story as a distillery. Melbourne's a great food city. It's so many different ethnicities come in there and develop this diverse culture there to create one of the great food meccas of the world. And if you talk to any person from Melbourne, they'll tell you it's the best food city in the world. It's like the number one foodies come out of there, they'll tell you. And what Dave, who is Italian Australian, he wants to bring Starward to every occasion possible. If that's the dining table, the cocktail bar, or just having it neat, he wants it to be there, wants it to be present. He wanted to bring whiskey back to that whole experience. And being a brewer, he was making these tropical fruit beers. He was tasting something that was really fun. And he thought, why don't I combine that with my love for single malt whiskey which could be a whole new initiative into making single malt whiskey with a whole new approach. Nothing about what we do is trying to replicate what Scotland or Ireland has done from generation to generation. It's all about what can Australia be, what can Starward really be for Australia. And with that, he wanted basically to be approachable to anybody. And if you liked it any certain way, please enjoy it that way. The best compliment I can get from anybody is saying a novice would enjoy this, but somebody who's a whiskey head would also love this too. And I think it's kind of what I'm feeling out here, and people I've talked to, especially the last few nights and some whiskey Zooms and some other things, is that this can be used and so versatile. We actually do something a little bit crazy and a little bit unique at our distillery, where our house cocktail is a whiskey tonic. And some people think that's pretty crazy, putting tonic in whiskey, especially single malt. But the twofold and also Nova, it really grates and interacts really nicely with the quinine from like all those fruit tannins you have inside of the whiskeys to create a really tropical, refreshing drink. And it's not about sitting back and resting on our laurels. It's about what we can do in the future to create something really new. And the cocktail experience is a huge part of what we do as a company. I don't go to bars to just sell it as a $55 bottle of single malt or a $30 bottle of a double grain whiskey. I go there and say like, hey, you can make some really terrific cocktails, old riffs and new riffs on what's been going on inside the mixology cocktail world over the last 10 to 15 years. So that's kind of what we wanted. You're hitting right on it. Like, we don't shy away from what this whiskey can possibly do inside of a cocktail, but also we believe it can stand by itself and make a really delicious whiskey just to drink neat or on the rocks.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Tom.
Thanks. Lynn, you had a question? Oh, you're muted.
I do. It's going to be a little off the wall. Gil and I have actually already discussed this. I bought the Solera, and I had great hopes. And I'll say from the outset, I am super, super, super sensitive to any hint of soapy taste. To me, the Solera had a ton of it. And as I was drinking these, I loved the Vinnies, no soapy taste. I liked the Nova for a lot of reasons. It had just a hint of it, but not enough to bother me. The 2 grain had none. But again, this is Solera from your sample as well as the bottle I have. And I find it just really hard to drink. So this is actually out for all of you folks. What on earth is going on that I am so sensitive to that soapy taste in whiskey?
Soapy. I was wondering maybe if it was the bottle sample I gave you that didn't wash it out good enough.
Actually, that I'm glad you brought that up, Jake, because Lynn gave me a sample from her bottle, and I actually compared it tonight, and I actually compared it. So Lynn, I got to tell you, I didn't get the soapy taste. Okay, so I think it's just something, there must be something in there that you're getting, because tonight, before I drank anything else, I took a nose on both of them. I tasted both of them. I even added water to both of them just to see. And I'm glad you brought that up, because Lynn, that's just something that you're getting. I wasn't getting, but if anybody else is getting anything like that, oh, Paul's raising his hand. Paul?
So I don't get a ton of that per se, but especially in, like beer and everything too. I don't understand all the precursors to taste and smell components as the caveat, but there's a connection between the banana esters and tastes and the taste perceived as soapy. So when you're saying that, that's one of the things, those tropical fruit notes that some of the stuff goes for, there is some kind of connection that maybe even somebody else knows more about, but between the chemical components that give you banana-y taste and soapy taste as perceived in some people.
Wow.
Yeah, that's where I was going to go with it too.
Sorry.
Yeah. Go ahead, Michael.
Michael?
Yep. Had to find the unmute. I was going to say, Len, you're not far off. I don't know if I describe it as soapy, but I'm going to be the flip of what Lynn was saying is I like the Solera the best. I found the Benny's single cast to be, to my palate, very tannic. And And I know that's because of the wine cask influence, but it's just way too strong for me. I couldn't drink that on a regular basis. The Solera I really enjoyed. Lynn, you'll find that same texture and oiliness that gets you that soapiness in old Bowmores too. It's like Bowmores from the 80s and 90s. So stay away from them. I did have a question though. I want to circle back to when you're talking about the twofold. You said there was a whiskey you developed for the American palate, or to import to America. And I was interested in why you chose to use wheat to do that. If you told me, we're doing a blend of malt whiskey and corn, I could see how that's going for the American market. It surprised me that you thought wheat fit that palate.
I think it's basically just with the popularity of what wheat whiskey has done over the last 5 years, and particularly that was kind of the genesis of it. And it's also just our owner loves Maker's Mark. I mean, he loves that whiskey, and it's a heavier wheated whiskey, a wheated bourbon, and want to combine those two. And with his, I think what I say was for the American market, there's a little bit more of a sweeter aspect to it, a little bit more of vanilla richness versus with Nova, which is a little bit more that spicier, peppier, traditional single malt feels. I think like Gil, you're way on it when it said like a Speyside, chocolatey, has that essence you get from like a Speyside to it, and nothing too overwhelming in flavor at 80, essentially at 80 proof, 82. It was just about making more of a creamier, more tropical, sweeter whiskey versus the Nova, which is a little bit more on that spicier end and has more of those I feel like a Pinot a dried Pinot kind of coming out of it, whereas like more of a dried Cabernet effect to the twofold in that sense too. But it was just more about, hey, we can make a wheated whiskey that's also gaining in popularity across the world. And now we look at what's happened with Sazerac and Buffalo Trace and all the BTAC and everything kind of going on. So it's more like catching a wave of popularity, but also using a second most readable grain in Australia with that wheat too.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Excellent.
thank you.
And also and again, thank you very much for all the samples. That's very generous of you.
Yeah, and let's get back to the samples real quick. It's the Solera is only the ounce sample, just because it's a little bit harder to find. We don't get a ton of it over here, but it is still available to pick up in the U.S.
Got it. Let's see. Does anybody else have any other questions or observations? Out of respect for Jake's time, I want us to be able to wrap this up by 8. Although, Jake, I do want to mention we always have an after party, but you are under no obligation to stick with us. Many of us, let's face it, it's COVID. We have nothing better to do, so we sit around drinking for a significant time afterwards. But you're under no obligation to continue with us. Feel free to do so.
I start PTO at noon tomorrow, so I'm pretty excited about that.
But does anybody else want to raise your hand? Have any questions, comments about the whiskeys that we're drinking tonight? Okay. All right. Got it. All right. So actually, I am going to, it's funny. We have had, Joshua Hatton and Jason Johnston Yellen from Single Cask Nation and Jewish Whiskey Company. Familiar with them? Yeah. So several of us are friends with them. And a while back, I asked when we interviewed them, they've tasted so many casks, when to bottle. And I asked them, how do they know when they found something that's worthy of being bottled by them? And Jason said what I found to be just the best answer. And he said, we keep going back to it. It's like when they're tasting different barrels at a distillery, they keep going back to it. And what I usually ask everybody to do at this time of the night is, if you don't have anything in your glasses and you are so inclined, please put a little bit more in one of your glasses. And the one that I am selecting to do so is the Binny Single Cask. That's the one I'm going back to. I think that this is absolutely delicious. And everybody, if you can all do me a favor, and if everybody could unmute, if you could unmute, that would be wonderful. And join me in saying cheers and thank you to Jake Hukee.
Cheers.
Cheers.
Thank you.
Jake, I got to tell you something. We, as I said, we've been doing this now since April. You're our 20th one. And our last one, we had Michael Bloom, who's one of our friends here. You met Michael at the, the contest a little while back when we were judging. He's the guy who does the 50-state blend, and he gave a number of us samples. But nobody's given us an offer like you have here, and this was just wonderful. It was just, really, really thank you for this. It made this a special occasion, and we got a great turnout here. So again, I just want to thank you, and really look forward to when we can have a dram at our local watering holes.
Oh yeah.
Very much looking forward to that.
Amen.
And everybody, again, cheers and thank you.
Cheers.
Cheers.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.